Shannon, I want to go to you. You think China is one of the top threats facing the markets right now. In terms of today's action, we're seeing, as I mentioned at the top, strength in small caps. Joe rightly pointed out the strength in financials that we're seeing up more than 1% in today's session. And that's signaling to me a market that believes there is a domestic recovery underway. How does China factor into that picture?
It's not dissimilar to what we saw in 2018 and 2019. When we start to hear of an escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China, people look domestic. They're going to be domestically oriented. And so even though we're not the strongest house on the block anymore, certainly following the coronavirus, and we still have a long way to go from an economic recovery perspective, I think Joe makes a good point in that you feel comfortable that you're not necessarily overly exposing yourself to what is likely to be escalation in tensions with China, certainly after the changes that they've made as far as free speech in Hong Kong. And then you're also benefiting from the fact that we are starting to feel that enthusiasm and optimism about the reopening. I would caution, I think that we're still looking past or perhaps not giving enough emphasis to the China situation. This is something that was an overhang to the market or at least portions of the market for about 2 years. And so I think once we move past this data around reopening, I do think that there will be a renewed focus on China. And I think the names that consistently were benefited from that previously, which were domestically oriented demand names, as well as technology names that were, seen as unfavorable in those periods. I do think we're going to start to see some volatility around that.
Rob, I want to go to you in terms of how the protests we've seen across the country over the weekend, continuing into this week, could play into a recovery. We have heard the corporate response in terms of store closures on the part of retailers like Target, delivery center closures on the part of Amazon, for instance, and just the notion that tensions could actually rise. We just got comments from Donald Trump, the president, who had a teleconference with the country's governor saying most of you are weak, and he's urging a crackdown, a response to the violence seen in the streets.
Potential social escalation, social tensions are something that can definitely be disruptive, along with what Joe said, along with what Shannon said. I mean, China's a re-emerging threat. Obviously, we saw what it did once before when there was trade tensions. Personally, I think there's a lot to worry about, and we've come very far, very fast. So I would say while it's lower probability, the magnitude of the downside is much greater than the potential for the upside. Yet I still think the potential for the upside is more likely. And so we have this cautiously optimistic view. If I were to look at what would help sustain this move, or at least allow us to build a base at new higher levels, it's the fact the number one most important thing, I think, is the Fed backstop. The Fed did in 2 weeks what it took 9 months to do in the global financial crisis. And then secondly is any progression on treatment or hopefully a vaccine as it relates to the virus. I think the worries are as we reopen reinfection rates and what damage that does. And then ultimately fiscal policy. I think early on, there was cooperation, and what our congressman did in delivering a stimulus package of $3 trillion in a month and a half was really unprecedented, given the way the legislative process works in the U.S. That is shocking what they were able to accomplish. And I think given all this social unrest, given all the tension, I think you're going to see a little more partisanship on those fronts. And so it's going to be a little tougher to get through what we want to get done. But again, cautiously optimistic. I think once we kind of get to those things and have to address them, if they're positive, I think there's upside. I just think it's not as much as you could potentially see if this breaks the wrong way.